Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today, we're going to be discussing The Secret of the Wooden Lady. But before we get started, I have a couple confessions to make. So with a serial podcast of this nature, I have actually been quite a few books ahead of the actual books that I'm doing in each episode. So I think a few episodes ago, I think on the episode about the Clue of the Tapping Heels, I was kind of lamenting the fact that I hadn't seen any snow yet, and I'm happy to report, well, probably most of you are aware, but there was like Snow Megadon. We had like a week worth of snow, and so it was a lot. But the great thing about that was that I got to read so many Nancy Drew books. I think I read like 5 or 6, and I got to play some of the games, and so that really helped me to get even more ahead of schedule for this podcast. So that's great. Not complaining about that. Like, just to give you guys an idea of how ahead of schedule I am, it's January as I'm making this episode, and this episode comes out in May. So it's a good problem to have. Now, that was confession number 1. Confession number 2, I realized the other day in posting the Ghost of Blackwood Hall episode that I have this tendency, and I don't know if it's just me or if there's anyone else out there in the Nancy Drew community that does this, please feel free to let me know. But it's almost like a Mandela effect. I see these names of characters in the books and it sounds similar to someone that I know or a name that I've heard before, and I swear that this is the name. And then it's not. So halfway through the Ghost of Blackwood Hall episode, just as an example, there's a character named Mrs. Putney, and for some reason, I just started calling her Mrs. Putnam in the middle. And then I also did this in the Whispering Statue episode. I think it was Debbie Lynbrook, and I started calling her Debbie Lynn Wood. I don't know why I do this. I think that all the characters start to blur together. But anyway, I'm aware that I did it, and I just wanted to let you all know. We just have fun on this podcast. Ain't no thing, but I don't know. I just felt like I needed to address that. Okay, so now that bit of housekeeping is out of the way, I can't wait to discuss this book, The Secret of the Wooden Lady. So I did not expect to like this book as much as I did, because the last book where Nancy was on a boat for an extended amount of time was The Mystery of the Brass-Bound Trunk, and we all know how I felt about that one, but I actually really loved this book. But before we get into why I loved it, we're going to discuss the different covers. So, The Secret of the Wooden Lady is the 27th book in the Nancy Drew Yellow Spines original series, and it came out in 1950, so we have 2 different covers to talk about today. So the original cover shows Nancy, Bess, and George in a little dinghy, and they have the wooden lady with them. She's like a figurehead off of the ship, and they're sailing away from a bigger ship, and it's a pretty cool cover. Nancy has more blonde hair in this cover. And in the second edition of this cover, I actually like this edition better than the original. We have Nancy, Bess, and George again in a dinghy, and they're in the waves. It's a very blue cover. It's very stormy looking, and they've got the figurehead behind them, which I think her name is Melissa, or Dreams of Melissa. We'll get to that in a minute. But Bess has like a purple kind of dress on, like this shock of blonde hair. George is wearing a blue dress, and she's got the shorter black hair, and Nancy has true red hair, and she's wearing a green dress. I know that Nancy and these girls don't have the best track record with boats, but I got really excited to read this book just by seeing the cover. But I did come up with a funny cover spoof, just looking at the cover if I didn't know what the book was about, and I came up with, I like big boats and I cannot lie. You other sailors can't deny. And when a girl walks in with a big anchor and drops it in the waves, you get soaked. I won't quit my day job. I'll stop while I'm ahead. But I gave these covers different ratings. I think the first cover gets 3 magnifying glasses for me, and the second gets 5, no doubt about it, because I thought it was just a really pretty book cover. Now, onto the characters in this book. There's a few, but there's Captain Easterly, who is the guy who owns this big boat in question. We're going to help him solve this mystery. There is Flip Howard Fay. That's a tongue twister. And his nickname is the Crow. He's a thief, and he's the bad guy. There's Mr. Farnsworth, who is the ship owner in question, there's a question of the deed on the ship, which we'll get to in a second. And there is Grizzleface / Red Quint, which, what a name. Red Lane, Walt Frisbee, which, oh my gosh, that sounds like Walt Disney. That's crazy. I just now realized that. But he is the figurehead making guy. He makes figureheads for a living. And then there is Mr. Ogden, who also turns out to be Fred Lane. It seems like every Nancy Drew book, there's a bait and switch where it's like this person is actually this person. But anyway. So without further ado, we'll jump right into the synopsis for The Secret of the Wooden Lady. Nancy's father, Carson, has been asked to advise a friend, Captain Easterly, on his purchase of a clipper ship, the Bonnie Scott, in Boston, and he asks for Nancy to come along. Nancy calls to tell Bess, and while they're on the phone, Bess hears an intruder in her home. The line goes dead. Nancy drives over to help, and a man overpowers her and knocks her out. Weak when she awakes in her car, she leans on the horn to get help, and the neighbors call the police. Bess is knocked out in a closet, and Nancy finds a ring belonging to the thief under the bed. When Nancy goes back home after a dance with Ned, a threatening man calls the Drew residence and tells them to stay away from Boston. Nancy follows a lead, and she and the police are sure it was Flip Fay who broke into the Marvins' home. Nancy and Carson head to Boston to meet Captain Easterly, and Bess and George meet them. The captain says he wants to buy the ship, but the owner wants him to keep renting, and ghostly lights have been appearing on board. Nancy soon gets pushed in a closet while a man ransacks the ship in search of something. She calls the man Grizzleface. Ned, Bert, and Dave come to visit the girls, and by this time, Nancy is sure Flip Fay is connected to this case, and Captain Easterly is missing. Nancy and Ned follow a lead on Grizzleface and find Captain Easterly being held against his will at a boarding house. Grizzleface, aka Red Quint, knows secrets about the ship, and Nancy begins to investigate its history, discovering its name and a treasure on board. The bad guys are once again captured, and in the end, Captain Easterly gets to keep his boat. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with that just kind of sums this all up is Nancy Drew does it again. Mystery ship's provenance and treasure discovered, and dangerous criminal, the Crow, put behind bars. Whew. Okay, so we're going to get right into these direct quotes on The Secret of the Wooden Lady. So the first note that I took down is Nancy is on the phone with Bess, and Bess says she hears someone upstairs and the line goes dead. So this was such a great way to start off this book. It really grabbed my attention because I was worried about Bess, and I mean, this is a nightmare for most kids of the 90s. If you ever watched a horror movie, it was always somebody on the extension and they're upstairs, or there's just someone sneaking around. And so Nancy goes to help her, but before she can get in the house, a man knocks her out. So I was not only worried about Bess, then I was worried about Nancy. So when Nancy wakes up, she's weak and she's been shoved into her car. So she leans on the horn of her car to get help. And when she finally goes back inside with the police, they find that Bess is in the closet and she's been knocked out. I get so worried when any of Nancy's friends like Bess or George or Hannah or anybody gets like knocked out or tied up or kidnapped. Like, I know they're going to be in the next books, but I still am just like, there's that momentary panic. But when Nancy and Bess finally come into consciousness again, Nancy finds a ring with the letter F under the Marvin's bed, and of course that stands for Flip Fay, and they don't know that at the time, but they find that out later. I also said in this book we get some of the better descriptions of Bess and George that we've gotten to this point. And it says, Bess, blonde and pretty, had a penchant for second desserts and frilly dresses. She shared Nancy's adventures out of deep loyalty to her, but was constantly fearful of the dangers involved. George was as boyish as her name. Her hair was dark, her face handsomely pert. George wore simple clothes and craved adventure. See, that was nice. I like those descriptions. Like, they didn't say that Bess was pudgy or plump or anything. They just said she liked second dessert. What is wrong with that? So my next note says, George gives Bess a ruby necklace her godmother gave her because she doesn't like jewelry. I thought that was kind of sweet, though, because normally George is just being mean to Bess, so it was kind of nice that she gave her some jewelry in this book. Okay, so the next thing that I wrote down, Donald Blake is a man at the ship museum that they meet in Boston, and I said, another man with two first names in the Nancy Drew universe, because we had Dawn Cameron, the guy that, like, briefly wanted to date Nancy and she wanted nothing to do with him. Donald Blake. We had the pigeon guy in Larkspur Lane. I cannot remember. His name was Donald Jordan or something. I don't know what it is with the men in the Nancy Drew universe, but a lot of them have two first names, and it's funny to me. Okay, so this next note, Nancy is in the captain's quarters of the Bonnie Scott, and someone sneaks up on her, throws a coat over her face, and shoves her in a closet. And she looks through a hole and sees that it's Grizzleface. So this person's real name is Red Quint, but for the first part of the book, Nancy doesn't know that, so she just gives him this nickname of Grizzleface. And so I'm just picturing like the Gorton's fisherman guy, like he's got a beard, he might carry a pipe in his mouth, I don't know, but Grizzleface, it's interesting. Also, at the time of making this episode, I've read a couple books ahead, and for some reason the villains like lately resort to throwing coats over Nancy's face or wrapping her up in like a bed sheet or something and shoving her into closets. It's interesting. I mean, it's effective, obviously, because they keep doing it, but just something I took note of. So Nancy goes to talk to the police and describes Flip Fay in his ring with an F on it. She says it also kind of looks like a crow's foot, and one of the policemen says there's a dangerous jewel thief with that hallmark called the Crow. I mean, as far as villains' names goes, that is pretty ominous. I mean, that's better than the Flamingo or something, but the Crow, I'm just picturing him showing up on the scene of the crime just like, caw. Birds of a feather commit crimes together. So George says she wants to get some sea flavor and walk along the docks. So she, Nancy, Bess, Bert, Dave, and Ned go and do that. And Nancy thinks she sees Flip Fay at a restaurant. So she asks Ned to see if he has a short middle finger, because apparently this is an identifier of Flip Fay. And Ned goes in and he pretends to fall into the table, and then the man with Flip punches Ned in the face. So Ned later says, 1 hour with Nancy Drew and I'm in combat. Which, you know, that's pretty fair, because a lot of times when people hang out with Nancy Drew, they get kidnapped or punched in the face or just bad things happen to them. But Nancy and Ned also find checkered cloth on a porthole of the Bonnie Scott like Flip was wearing, so that proves he's been on the ship snooping around. Okay, so I haven't encountered a word in a while that I've never heard before, but this was an interesting descriptor of Grizzleface's eyebrows, and it said frowsy eyebrows. Like, next time I go to Ulta or somewhere and I make an appointment for my eyebrows and be like, hey, you need to get rid of these frowsy eyebrows, can you like clean this up for me? So my next note just says, Nancy and Ned follow a lead on Red Quint, aka Grizzleface with the frowsy eyebrows, and end up at a boarding house where they find Captain Easterly, and he's sick and he's been held against his will. So he went missing for like 2 or 3 days, and it wasn't until like day 2 that everybody's like, okay, where's Captain Easterly? So I'm glad they found him, but this happens a lot to people in the Nancy Drew books. They go missing and then they're found and they're drugged, and it's just scary how much it happens. While we're talking about Captain Easterly too, I thought it was interesting. He's a captain of a boat, but he doesn't talk like he is, if that makes sense. Like Sailor Joe in Nancy's Mysterious Letter was just like, you know, my wife cast off at 6 bells or whatever, but this guy who is an actual captain, it's like he doesn't have to prove it or like try so hard. I don't know. So the next thing that I took note of is Nancy decides to convince Easterly to sail the ship away from shore to prevent more intruders from getting on board. But before they get out of the harbor, the ship is on fire, and Nancy sees a stowaway jump overboard. So, you know, too late. But they see clues someone else is still on board when they find a hatchet and a hole in the wall. There's people just like trying to get to this treasure inside the walls of this ship. And there's food missing from the galley, and they find an old snuff box on the floor, and then there's this horrible storm. I actually loved the scene where there was a storm because Nancy, Bess, George, and Captain Easterly, they all worked together to get this ship in working order. And I'm like, you don't need a meteor falling out of the sky sometimes. Like, you just need a good old storm. I'm looking at you, Mystery of the Brass-Bound Trunk. So the next thing that I wrote down is Ned says the girls can come along on another ship adventure because, quote unquote, every clipper needs cooks. And it says that the girls grimace, and I love that. I love that Nancy, Bess, and George were just like, Ned, you're not funny. Like, we just got the Bonnie Scott out of this storm. How about a little respect? So, good old Grizzleface steals Nancy's purse and takes the snuff box back, and he tells Nancy that it's his, and he admits to being a stowaway, but then he just runs away. So, Nancy catches up with him a little bit later, and it's about at this point in the book where Nancy starts to investigate figureheads and ships, and she goes to Walt Frisbee's shop and finds information about a ship called Dream of Melissa that went missing. And I was just like, Dream of Melissa? Like, I know Melissa's an older name, but not like that old. I don't think of Melissas as living in the 17 or 1800s. I don't know, like maybe Gwendolyn or something, but Melissa. Okay. Another note that I took down is Nancy refers to pirates as sea gangsters, and I said, honestly, I love that. I'm going to start referring to them as sea gangsters. Because that's basically what they are. Now, see here, we're going to come rob your ship and we're going to kill haul you, and we don't want no funny business. So Nancy catches Flip Fay sneaking on board, and he drops a matchbook that he wrote Marvin on. So this further ties him to the break-in and robbery of the Marvin's home, and Nancy is really starting to close in on him. And then shortly after that, Nancy finds proof that the Bonnie Scott is actually the Dream of Melissa when she finds the name carved under a bench in the galley and on a timber in the crew quarters. So then she's able to identify why these people keep coming after the ship, because they want this treasure that's supposedly on board. So this next note was kind of funny, but Nancy receives a package delivered to the ship with skulls and crossbones on it, and inside it is a lizard. And so Captain Easterly freaks out about it, and he says it's bad luck, and he just throws it overboard. I'm just picturing them opening this little cardboard box, which, okay, because this guy's like, package for Nancy Drew, and she just pulls it up over the top of the ship, and yeah, they just throw this iguana overboard. Now, Nancy finds out that Red Quint, aka Grizzleface, poses as a model for painters. I guess he just has that fisherman quality, that look to him. But Bess says, I'd like to paint his beard too. Like, what? And the last note that I took down is Nancy finds the figurehead, and there's a ruby inside of it, and Flipface steals it. And in a twist, Mr. Ogden is Fred Lane, not the real Ogden, and they tie Nancy, Bess, and George up and set the boat adrift to sea. Basically, Fred Lane was in cahoots with Flipface, and surprise, surprise, he was pretending to be Mr. Ogden, who was like this real estate guy who owns the ship and can enforce the girls to get off of it. I don't know. But Nancy, Bess, and George are able to get untied, and they're able to steer the ship back into safety. Now onto the segment of this podcast that I like to call What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen. And Hannah did a little bit of cooking in this one. I've kind of missed seeing her cooking, but she made some fried chicken, and then Bess also cooked on the boat. Briefly, she made bacon and eggs. I also like to do a segment on the podcast called Add That to Your Resume, and I said that Nancy could add Seaworthy Sailor to her resume finally, because it's only taken us 27 books, and now she can finally sail a boat properly. Well done. I mean, I don't expect this skill to last, because if there's another trope in the Nancy Drew series, it's that Nancy has all these skills and then she magically forgets them later, or she suddenly knows how to speak Scandinavian out of nowhere. Now onto the things that I liked and the things that I didn't like about The Secret of the Wooden Lady. So I wrote down, this book was so good. The plot, the descriptions, criminals, and twists, the setting, I loved all of it. I felt like this was a very well-rounded book. And as far as the things I didn't like, I couldn't think of anything. I felt like this book was great. There weren't any like racist things in it. There was, a good plot. I mean, that's all I ask of in a book. So for my book rating, I gave this book 5 magnifying glasses, and it's been a little while since I've really done that. I mean, there's some books that fall just barely short of it, and then there's some that I'm like, no way, this is just 1 period. But I really liked this book. If you want to read a good Nancy Drew book, this is a great one. So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about The Clue of the Black Keys. And if you like books where Nancy figures out where treasure is, even though she never steps foot in Mexico, or Ned getting jealous about the fact that Nancy talks to a professor, then you will enjoy this book. Thank you again so much for listening, and if you guys want to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're listening, I would greatly appreciate it. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.